Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I know what you're thinking. It's been a long time since I've been here, but I'm back and we're in the studio. And today, I have a special guest. It's my friend and also someone that's taught me a lot so far, and that's Jim Delaney. So, I mean, we should just start off and just tell people like a little bit about yourself. Like, why should they listen to you? I mean, obviously, I know you know a lot, but we got
Well, I'm not sure how much I know, but yeah. Uh, yeah, Jim Delaney. I am a philosophy professor at Niagara University. I have been at Niagara since 2004.
damn.
So before that, I grew up in Cincinnati and went to Xavier University for my undergrad, and then went to the University of Buffalo to do
Oh,
my
nice.
graduate work. That's where I got my PhD, and then sort of a um, kind of an amazing coincidence. Most
Yeah.
people that do their graduate work, if you're lucky enough to get a job, you end up moving like hundreds of miles away.
Yeah. No, seriously.
But I ended up getting a job, just up the road. So I've been in
Yeah.
Buffalo since 1999,
Wow.
and yeah. So most of my work is in in ethics, the area of philosophy that has to deal with questions about value, the nature of a good life,
Yeah.
the nature of right and wrong, sort of some of the applications of that, like
Mm.
particularly in medicine is one of the areas I work in. And so most of my work is to teach students at Niagara, and then
Right.
to write my own scholarly literature that we takes a long time to try to get it
Yeah.
published in form of articles um, and books and so forth. So keeps me busy.
No, I can imagine. And like, I'm kind of like just curious. So like, with all that being said, like you've been in philosophy like forever now. So I guess like for you, like what was like what made you want to get into it in the first place? Because philosophy is like a very huge thing.
Yeah. It's sort of I think my story is probably not unique. Like a lot of people, I sort of came to philosophy not exactly by accident, but it
Mm,
really wasn't something that I was seeking out. So um, I think that I had always sort of been philosophically curious, maybe you
mm,
could call it. So I remember even being like a little kid, just
yeah,
kind of sort of wondering like these,
yeah,
these, these sorts of questions, just like, what if when I look at that apple and it's red, what if when you look at it it's blue? And like, how would I ever know? you know?
yeah, yeah.
And so these little thoughts would come in my head, um, and so when I got to college, when I went to Xavier, very similar to what we do at Niagara. So
Yeah.
when you most undergraduate programs,
Mm-hmm.
there are these general education courses,
Okay.
right? So courses that, regardless of what major you're declaring, you have to take. So whether
Yeah.
you're an accounting major or an education major
Right.
or chemistry major, or whatever, everybody takes these certain courses.
Okay.
And much like Niagara at Xavier, you had to take three philosophy courses. And the first course that I ever sat in college was Intro to Philosophy. I remember it was
Really.
8 a.m., so I was like, oh, and I was dreading it, but
Yeah, that's
immediately
early.
I was like grabbed by this course. And so when I went into college initially, I thought that I wanted to be a lawyer,
Really.
and I thought if you wanted to be a lawyer, that you should major in political science, even though I didn't really know what political science was.
Okay.
And after that first course, I thought, wow, maybe I'll actually minor in philosophy. And then after the second philosophy requirement, I thought
Yeah.
maybe I'll major in philosophy, dump political science, and then I'll go to law school. And by the time I took the third philosophy course, I thought, I don't want to go to law school at all. I want to
Yeah.
keep doing this for as long as I can.
I don't blame you.
And it was so yeah, it was one of those things that just a required course, and it grabbed me, and I kind of fell in love with it, and was lucky enough to be able to find a road to keep doing it.
Wow. That's crazy. And also, like you said that you're like I guess you could say, for lack of a better word, like your expertise is like in ethics.
Yeah.
So I mean, I understand that we talked a little bit about that in the past, but really, like, what does that like involve?
Yeah. So um, one of the things, sometimes we talk about it in class, but
Mm-hmm.
any like scholarly discipline,
Yeah.
right, is going to have these different subfields, right? So if you're a historian, maybe you would specialize in American history or
Yeah.
European history or what have you. So in philosophy, there's these like subdivisions,
Mm-hmm.
and the subdivisions are kind of what sorts of questions, what sorts of philosophical questions are you interested in?
Okay.
And so there's definitely like overlap, like
Yeah.
what you think like metaphysics is one
Mm-hmm.
area of philosophy where it's like in part concerned with just the nature of the world around you, right?
Right.
Does the world actually exist in the way that it comes to you through your five senses, for example? Like,
Very
well, what
thoughtful.
you think the world is going to be like is to some extent going to affect like questions about how you should live your life, and that's an ethical sort of question.
Mm.
So I think like ethics is that area that is concerned with these fundamental questions about like how you should live your life.
Yeah.
What does a good human life look like? What are your ethical obligations to other people or to non-human creatures, right? Um, and so I always sort of gravitated, I guess, to those questions. When I first got into philosophy, I was
Yeah.
sort of interested in all of it. But the other thing that happens as you kind of move further and you specialize, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know, like if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Like part of me thinks like the great philosophers of old, like they
Right.
didn't have specializations. Like Aristotle,
Yeah.
Kant, they wrote on everything, right?
Yeah.
So, but just the nature of the academy now is that you sort of work your way into a specialty. So what is this area of specialization? And so that was sort of a hard thing for me to choose when I was in graduate school. So I remember kind of sort of thinking maybe I'll specialize in, you know, these areas of like epistemology, like theories of like knowledge or like formal logic, like but it was funny, it was always sort of those ethical questions that pulled me in, and it was always sort of those ethical questions that I came back to.
Yeah. So like just for like the listeners, could you give like a specific example of like one of those questions that like really hooked you in?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. I think that one of the I'll give you two actually.
Okay.
And
I
so
like
one of
that.
them you're already familiar with because you and I have already talked about it. But I remember reading a very famous part of Plato's Republic, right? So
Okay.
Plato, ancient Greek philosopher, and Plato is in the Republic trying to answer this question of like what is justice and why is it good to be just, right? What do you get out of it, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so one of the concerns that Plato explores is whether there's a good reason to be a good person if it's not in your interest to do so.
Right.
So like there's the famous ring of Gyges story where if you had a ring that made you invisible and you could do anything you wanted without fear of punishment, how many of us would still be good people? We would still be honest. We would still like meet our obligations and I felt so sort of troubled by that in a way because I was like, gosh, maybe it does just come down to like selfishness. Maybe the only reason we follow the rules is just because we're afraid of being punished or something.
Yeah.
And so, but it was through reading some other responses to that I found some really good responses. So that challenge, right? That challenge about like, you know, maybe we're all just selfish initially seemed, I didn't like that. I thought it was true, but I was like, I don't know how it could be true.
I know.
And now I'm not at all concerned. I think it's pretty obviously false. So
You do think it's
I
false?
do, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So that was in my own life one of those things where like philosophy kind of took me down a road that was hard. I didn't want to think that about human beings, but through doing more and answering more, I kind of came to a conclusion that I believe with that I actually am much happier with. So that was one of the topics that really grabbed me for a long time.
Yeah.
The second one, and this is in part kind of why when I said earlier I made that decision of like I just want to keep doing philosophy.
Yeah.
I read some of Aristotle's ethics. So Aristotle, another ancient Greek philosopher, actually a student of Plato.
Okay.
And we've talked about some of Aristotle's ethics previously, but one thing that you and I haven't talked about as much is at the very end of Aristotle's ethics, he says, well, there has to be some like ultimate purpose. Like what's the best way that a human being could live, right?
That's a great question.
Yeah. And I thought, that is a great question. So Aristotle thought, and this argument, like, at the time, like, really made sense to me. He's like, well, if there's a best kind of life, it must kind of focus on whatever the best part of human beings are, right? And so,
what is that?
What is that, right?
Yeah.
So he says, what is it that makes us special? And he says, surprisingly, like, maybe he's a little biased, philosophy. That is reason, contemplating the big sorts of questions, right? So he says, just this sort of idea of as much as you can, just sort of deading yourself to contemplating the big sorts. So he talks about like the life of contemplation, right? These things that are like bigger and more important than just mere human existence, right?
Yeah.
And again, I thought to myself, like, that seems right. And how do I do that? Well, I guess I need to like pursue philosophy.
Yeah.
Now, I will say that one, I wasn't on board with that for as long because
Right.
I started thinking, well, what else is there? Because if it's like beyond the human,
Hmm.
like these questions about like the deepest kinds of questions of like the nature of the universe, I'm like, but my human concerns do seem sort of important. I do care about the day to day. I do
Right.
care about like
Yeah.
so in the great cosmic scheme of things, like maybe my little relationships and projects aren't so important, but they're important to me,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I did sort of a 180 on that, and there's actually an interesting tension in Aristotle because Aristotle doesn't talk about that contemplative life until the end,
So
but
that,
the whole rest of the end of the book of the Nicomachean
okay.
Ethics, the whole preceding part of it, well, at least a lot of it, is about those human sorts of relationships. So he's like, how do we become courageous? How do we become generous? How do we become...
Yeah.
And so those things, and there's really an interesting tension that I had a wonderful professor in graduate school named Jiwon Yu, unfortunately passed away a few years ago.
Rest in peace.
And he was the one that sort of said, how do you resolve this tension? On one hand,
Right.
Aristotle's
Yeah.
saying, live this human existence with other human beings, like kind of
Yeah.
here, but at the same time he's saying go beyond, explore these deep components, but you can't dedicate your life to both. So how do you resolve this tension? And I'm not sure that Aristotle really gives us a great answer to that,
Yeah.
but I think it's such an important kind of tension. It's not resolved, but like we're sort of pulled in two different directions, right?
Yeah.
We live in the now, right? But we also are sort of pulled to these deeper, bigger questions that go beyond just meager human experience, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's just maybe the answer is there is no answer. Maybe part of the human condition
Yeah.
is to just kind of feel pulls in both of those directions.
It's funny they said that because that's actually the one thing I was like really wondering because since I've been like learning more about philosophy, I've been starting to feel like a really conflicted like internally because I heard this one quote a while ago and that it's like we question all the beliefs we have except for those that we really believe. And when I heard that, I was like, wow, it really got me thinking. And I guess there's this tension in me because there's like a lot of uncertainty now.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm kind of wondering like how do you deal with that? Because that's like it seems like that's the whole purpose of philosophy.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that philosophers try to pride themselves on is the idea of following the argument wherever it goes.
Mm.
And so that means giving the most charitable interpretation that you can possibly give to like an opponent. And I don't mean an opponent like
Yeah, yeah.
in a like an adversarial
Yeah,
sort of
I get what
sense.
you're saying.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just somebody that holds like the opposite position that you hold. And I think that on one hand, like philosophers are maybe better than some others at doing that because that's just how we're trained. Like that's our
Right.
method.
Yeah, yeah.
But it would be naive to think that philosophers are somehow, exempt from like all the normal
Right.
human kinds of biases and that everyone else is. So like, and you probably know some of these things. There's like a lot of behavioral psychology now that we know. Like, unfortunately, like we're not nearly as rational as we think we are. Like
Really?
we are, yeah, we are plagued by things like confirmation bias,
Okay.
like these sorts of things. If you, we have this. Sometimes there's even been like this phenomena of like sometimes people if they really like hold a belief strongly
Yeah.
and you present them evidence that goes against their belief,
Yeah.
they not only will reject it, they will be more certain of their original belief than before. It's like
That doesn't make
instead
any
of like saying
sense.
that's interesting, maybe I should
Yeah.
rethink it. Like we double down, So I think that like anyone else, like that's always going to be the goal, right? Is because we want to really genuinely like question our beliefs, but like you say,
Yeah.
especially like deeply held beliefs, it's hard to do.
It is definitely difficult.
And I think maybe nobody's going to do that perfectly.
Right.
Right. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It doesn't mean we can't be better at it.
No, for sure, definitely,
And
yeah.
so I think philosophy has helped me to do that. I think that it's interesting where I'll often find myself like in social situations where people will be expressing these like beliefs and just sort of
Yeah.
like, and I might have mentioned this. It's like, and just this idea like, and anybody that doesn't believe as I'm believing,
Yeah.
it's just like they're either not intelligent
Right.
or they're evil or
Yeah.
something like that.
No, for sure.
And even if I'm inclined to agree with the belief they're
Hmm.
expressing, I'm just like, but I'm not sure that
Yeah.
holding the opposite belief is that implausible. Maybe
Right.
not quite as implausible as you're making it.
That's
And,
definitely true.
and so I think that that really goes back to um, I'm hitting off all the classic Greek philosophers, right? We've talked
Yeah.
about Plato, we've talked about Aristotle, but that's really what Socrates is most famous for. Like Socrates famously says philosophy is all about questioning. And Socrates, we don't have any written things from Socrates. We have
Mm.
second-hand accounts. Plato wrote and told us a lot about Socrates. But that Socrates famously says at his trial, he's brought up
Yeah.
and ultimately sentenced to death in Athens for corrupting the youth.
That's
and,
so ironic.
and he says, I've never claimed to know anything. All I did is ask people questions. I say, you're such an expert on justice or piety or
Yeah.
beauty or whatever. Tell me about it. And people would tell him about it.
Hmm.
And he would just ask him questions. He'd be like, well, if you believe that justice is this,
Yeah.
what about this? What about this implication of your view? And they would say, well, I don't mean that. And he's like,
Yeah.
well, what do you mean? And eventually he would expose that these people like didn't have quite as coherent a picture of these things as they thought they did. But Socrates said, the only reason I'm considered wise
Yeah.
is that I at least know that I don't know anything.
Yeah.
Right?
That's where I heard it from.
And that I think is one of the things that, at least personally for me, philosophy has I think helped me to develop. I could probably be better, like anybody.
Well, of course.
But intellectual humility, right? Just sort of knowing there's a lot of stuff I don't know. And even if I feel pretty sure about this belief, maybe there's an argument out there that
Yeah.
I haven't heard yet that might dissuade me of it.
It's really funny you brought that up when it comes to like Socrates, because the one thing that I used to like look into a lot was like Socratic questioning.
Yeah.
Like when it comes to less of the like philosophical, I guess it's like still philosophy, but more like negative emotions.
Yeah.
You know, obviously negative is like arbitrary, but feelings that don't feel good. So I guess for you, because like the reality is, this is something that's been debated, but I feel like in life, at some point, there's going to be like suffering at some point.
Sure.
So I guess really for that, it's like, has there been like a specific philosophy, like principle or just thought process in general that's like helped you to get through, I guess, like dark times?
Yeah. The reason I'm pausing is because it's such a good question, and my first thought, kind of off the cuff, is going to sound like I'm going to give you the obnoxious philosopher answer, and I don't mean it to be
No, it's okay.
obnoxious, but it's part of the reason that it's hard is I think about times where I really when I think about the things that were the hardest in my life to deal with, and I think about like losing both of my parents,
Yeah, it's terrible.
And others, and those are really, I think, not just them but other, like, those were the hardest things to sort of get through. When I went through all of those things, I had already been kind of immersed in the philosophical life
Yeah.
for like numbers of years. So part of what I wonder sometimes is what would that experience have been like for me had I not,
Right, yeah.
So the kind of fancy philosophy word for this is the counterfactual, right? But like, if everything would have been the same except
Yeah.
I wouldn't have had any philosophical training, I would have like done something else. Like, would it have been harder for me or would it have been easier for me?
That's
So
an interesting
I
question.
think if I were to try to speculate, I think that it's maybe a little bit of both. I think
That's
in some ways, just sort of studying these big questions for a long time,
Yeah.
it's my job to think about these things, and
Yeah.
so it can sometimes create more suffering. It can
Really?
sometimes make a hard situation harder because you kind of go down that philosophical road and you start thinking about those arguments and you start asking these why questions, and it's hard to let go of that when maybe
That's very
maybe
interesting.
it would feel better not to
Not-
be in your head so much, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think it does give you some tools to think about these things in maybe a little bit of a, I I don't want to say deeper because I don't want to be like I don't want to give the sense that like somehow if you study philosophy that you have some privileged kind of position. Suffering hurts
Yeah.
no matter who you are or no matter what you do.
Very true.
And whether you've read every book in the world or none.
Yeah.
But I will say that like sometimes thinking these why questions and like not just questions about dealing with hard experiences, but just questions about like the standards that you set for yourself to live by. I think philosophy has helped me to set what I think are pretty good standards and to take those standards seriously. And again, I don't mean to say that like somehow philosophers as a group have more integrity than others, but at least my personal feeling is I think it's been an asset in how I like that is the question we talked about like from Aristotle before. Like what do you want your life to be? Like what does a flourishing human life really look like?
Yeah.
And how do you get there?
That's a really tough question to answer. I mean, I would imagine that like everything would be relative.
So,
or is there like a morally better answer?
So, there's a couple questions in what you just said. So, one question is it's like kind of goes back to the egoism question a little bit that you might think.
And could you just refresh on like what is egoism?
Yeah, so egoism is we said earlier with like this question of why be just, why be moral.
Okay.
So suppose that you just think your life goes well. A good life is subjective in the sense that whatever makes you feel good.
Yeah.
Like to the degree you experience pleasure, for example, is what well-being consists of. And that's one of the there's three main players in the well-being literature
Really?
of like what does it mean for your life to go well. And so that view that pleasure is ultimately what it comes down to is called hedonism. There are different versions of it.
Yeah.
But if that's true, then it seems like your life goes well to the extent that like you experience pleasurable things, whatever it is that gives you pleasure. Now, that on a view like that, it doesn't seem like there's any necessary connection between a good life and a moral life.
Yeah.
Because you could be the type of person that just takes great pleasure in doing like really, really awful things to people.
Yeah, that's very true. It's true, yeah.
And so I think you'd be impressed that I've waited this long, to ask you a question. So now I say back to you. So I don't know. Does that seem like, would you want to say that's a good life?
A good life.
The person is experiencing pleasure, but they're experiencing pleasure by doing like really awful, cruel things to other people. They just don't care.
I mean,
because if it's all subjective, it's like, yeah.
That's a really tough thing because like kind of like the way I see it. What I'm about to say is going to sound horrible, but the best way I could say this is like the rules are more of like in society like what's considered to be okay was deemed like normal thousands of years ago. Like so for example, what I mean is, if a man kills another man, it's wrong, but if like for example like a bear kills a fish, it's okay.
Yeah.
Like for me, obviously there's lots of reasons why we could say that's okay, and then when we do it, it isn't. But also to another degree, part of me also wonders, like, why is it okay in the natural world? Well, I guess it's all natural, but
yeah,
in like the wildlife, but because we're civilized, it's not.
Yeah.
So since I do live in civilization, I do want to say like that's wrong, but also from a, I guess like view from above, I would say it doesn't really make much sense.
So yeah, like the view from above would just sort of say like, what are these things that you're taking pleasure in, right?
Yeah.
Are there better kinds of things to take pleasure in? So, so on other theories of well-being, and you might think of hedonism, this view we're talking about, like pleasure as sort of a subjective kind of theory. I mean, subjective is kind of a loaded word because like, but often in the literature it's kind of referred to that way. On the other side of it is there's a view of well-being. It's sometimes called an objective list theory of well-being, and it's an objective theory. And on that theory, the idea is just the kinds of creatures that we are, that there are just things that are valuable to us that make our lives go well, like sort of independent of whether we happen to take pleasure in them or not. And what would those things be? Like, what are the ingredients that make for like a good, flourishing human life? And there's no great mystery about it. So a lot of times in my classes, when I introduce this view, I'll have everybody, I say, list the 3 most important things in your life. And the reason that I do that is because it's almost the same, like 4 or 5 things. It's things like, so some people will say things like, my car, but like, then you're like, well, is it really your car? And like, yeah. But when you kind of push that and say, well, why is it? Then it's things like your relationships with your family and friends. It's things like having meaningful work to support yourself, like success in projects and endeavors. It's things like autonomy. It's things like living your life in the way that you want. It's free of sort of controlling influences, making your own path. It's things like knowledge, like the world's a fascinating place. Like when you learn true stuff about it, like that's pretty cool.
Definitely.
And so that theory of well-being, right, is sort of a rival, right? So when we talk about philosophy, we talk about arguments, like in the well-being literature, like what is a good life? And you say, well, isn't it just subjective? Some people think so. Some people think like, yeah, your life goes well to the extent you get the things that you like, pleasure, whatever those things happen to be. On the other hand, there's a view that says these are sort of the ingredients of a good life. And somebody that has those things is going to, from that top down, I forget the expression you used exactly, the from above kind of view, is it's going to be like doing better, right? And of course, there's like tons of different arguments about that. But notice you asked the moral kind of question of, is there sort of like a good life and you're going to be a moral person at the same time? Well, it's sort of like, does well-being, does the good life for you include being moral or not? If you're just a hedonist, if you just think it's about pleasure, then probably, if it makes you feel good to be nice to people, then it makes your life go better.
Yeah.
But if you take the other view, like an objective list theory, well, of course, like how could you have meaningful friendships and relationships if like that's one of the ingredients?
Yeah.
How could you have those things if you were treating people terribly, right? You'd be incapable of having real friendships and relationships. So when you say like, well, what's this relationship between the good life and the moral life? It depends. What do you think the good life is?
Sounds about right. Good old classic.
That's and that's one of the things that I think is people that there are some people that really love philosophy, and there are people that really hate it, and it's funny. That's the reaction I get if I'll meet people and they'll ask, what do you do? I say, I teach philosophy, and inevitably, they will say, I took a philosophy class, and the next line will be, and I loved it, or and I hated it.
That's hilarious.
So sometimes when people ask me what I do, I'm sort of tempted to just be like, I work in real estate, because then there'll be like no follow-up questions.
Yeah,
so
no, definitely.
No, I wouldn't do that. But
no, I know what you mean.
But and I think like there's different reasons for that too. I think that, but I think one of the reasons is sort of like the frustration of like when you're trying to answer a question that's of importance to you, a philosophical question, that so often the answer is, it depends.
Yeah.
And like, that's what happened in our exchange right now. When you say like, well, is it good life? Doesn't mean you have to be moral. Like, it depends. I think for some people, the it depends is like, you want to keep going.
Yeah.
Right.
Very ambiguous.
But I think for others, it's just like intensely frustrating. My younger sister is probably my best friend in the world. um, she's an actuary, right? So
Oh,
she does
that's a fun
just
job.
math, right? So, and she says that's why I like being an actuary and I would hate being a philosopher. And so I might have even like joked about this in class before, but she'll sometimes still kind of needle me. She's like, "Oh, how things going? Did you guys prove whether God exists yet?" And I'm like,
Yeah.
"No, not yet. We're still working on it." You know, so that uncertainty, she's like, that just drives me nuts.
Yeah.
For me, it doesn't, right? So I think like maybe that's sort of a personality sort of thing. But if you'll indulge me, I have one other thing I want to say about kind of a related issue, and
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I think like so I think some people just are not wild about philosophy because of that. But I think like the person that I had a philosophy class and I hated it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times it's just a bad experience because like the instructor
Yeah.
didn't didn't present it in such a way
I agree.
that
100%.
it you know and that when I hear that it just I hate it because I think
Yeah.
and I'm not saying I'm a great teacher or anything, but I do think that like
I mean, you're here.
well these but like how could you manage to make those questions not interesting and important? Like,
Yeah.
these are the most profound kinds of questions that we can ask each other, right? Like,
Yeah.
what is my place in the world? Like, how do I know the nature of reality? Can I know anything? Like, and if somehow like you make those questions not like compelling, then I think it's sort of on you, not the student that hates the class. I guess is
Yeah.
my thought. I mean, I know everyone at Niagara loves their philosophy classes, so it's not a problem.
No, yeah, for sure.
Right.
Huh. And also, I mean, earlier, like you said, that there was like the things to what are like the best way to live life.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
usually that, I mean, you know, historically it's
Yeah.
sort of gone under different names, but like in contemporary value theory is sort of the area where you might think of it now, and like, and usually it's called well-being literature,
Okay.
like different theories of well-being. And yeah, that was that debate has gotten I've gotten really interested in that.
Yeah.
I guess it's been a while now, but that was a little bit later. So some of these other topics that we've talked about were sort of like when I was an undergrad or like earlier on in graduate school. The well-being literature, I was sort of like aware of it, but I didn't get like deeply into it until sort of at the tail end of when I was finishing up my graduate work, and then like even my first few years at Niagara. Like and I got into it like almost kind of indirectly because I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that I do a lot of work in medical ethics, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of those questions, as I was thinking about them, and specifically topics about, you know, when you're going to like withdraw life support from a patient, right? So maybe the patient's permanently unconscious or something like
tough.
that. And so how do you, and so often in those debates, and you know, I'm sure you know this, right? That like sometimes we come to these questions like, well, was it still like a good life for this person? You know, are they still benefiting from this in some way? And these questions about like autonomy that come up in bioethics, right? So like, what if somebody is requesting something from a doctor, but we might really worry that this isn't, you know, good for them or something. And so you get into like, well, would it make their life go better or not? And so that kind of through those discussions is where I kind of came into like the more straightforward like well-being questions, and that was one of those moments, right? There's been a handful where I can sort of literally remember where I was sitting and reading, you know, this and being like, wow. And like, on one hand, like I'd never thought about this before, or I had thought about it, but sort of in a muddled way. And this is sort of what my brain was trying to get at.
Yeah.
And these sort of like watershed moments. But the well-being literature was one of those kind of moments. And it's sort of been both professionally and personally, like something that I think about probably every day.
What were they? Because I mean, you got me like on the edge of my seat.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here wondering.
I mean, so I said before that there are like these three kind of main theories of well-being.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could go on and on, but I'll just tell you like that there's sort of a puzzle with it. So the first one is usually the one that you brought up. So hedonism. So you might think like your life goes well to the extent that you have pleasurable experiences. And there's different versions of it, we can just say. But what do we know about pleasure? That seems to be like a mental state. It's something that you experience, right? So it doesn't make any sense for me to talk about like me having a pleasure that I don't experience, right? I would say that's sort of like saying, could you picture an unmarried bachelor or something like that?
No, it's not
right?
possible.
So if that's true, then it seems that pleasure is just a matter of like positive mental states.
Right.
But what if your positive mental states didn't correspond with anything that was actually in the world? So there's a very famous philosopher named Robert Nozick, and he's the one that's sort of credited with showing like here's the big problem with the hedonism theory of well-being if it's just a matter of what's in your head. And now, so he wrote this in the 1970s. I think it was the 1970s. As you know, my dates are terrible. But,
yeah, it's okay.
But and it's funny, like now, this was very science fiction-y at the time, but now we're like, who knows? We might be getting closer to it. He says, imagine there was an experience machine. And the experience machine, you can tell the scientists or whoever to hook you up to it, and whatever kind of life you want, so you and I might want completely different sorts of experiences. So maybe I want to win the Masters golf tournament because I'm a big golfer, right? And so, so I want to do that, and I want to, live in a big house, and I want all these sorts of things, and I can make it as detailed as I want, and I have it perfect, and then they say okay, and then they plug me into the experience machine, and the way Nozick describes it is like you're just like floating in a tank, but the experience machine is providing you with your dream life.
That's interesting.
Everything you want, and it's perfect. And Nozick says at the end of this description, now you might think, but it would be too easy, right? Like you can program in you want some struggles, like so go ahead, put that in the program. Like I lose the Masters heartbreakingly for 2 years and then I win, so it's like super fine. You want trials and tribulations? We can program that in however you want, whatever you want. And he says, would you plug in? And most people say, of course not. Of course I wouldn't plug in.
Yeah, it's funny because that's what I was thinking. I was thinking, like, I don't think it would.
Yeah, most people don't think it would. But notice if hedonism is the right theory of well-being, you should.
Right.
Because all that matters is positive mental states. This gives you all the positive mental states. So some people think, well then, okay, hedonism can't be the right theory of well-being. So one of the responses is, well, what's the problem with the experience machine? And the problem seems to be, it's not that I want the experience of winning the Masters. I actually want to win the Masters. Somehow my well-being is about what's actually the case, like in the world, right? I don't want artificially created like friends and family. I don't want the experience of being loved by my wife and son. I want to actually be loved by them. And the experience machine can't get me that. It can only get me the feeling of it.
That's interesting.
And so that leads to the second major theory of well-being, which is called desire fulfillment theory. And this theory says your life goes well to the extent that your desires are actually fulfilled, right? But that raises sorts of questions. And so some people think like, well, what about desires that are just like, kind of going back to what we said before, like, they're like really cruel. What if your strongest desire is to like cause pain in others? Like, that seems like not. That doesn't seem like a good life. Or like it seems like it'd be better. Or another famous philosopher who was actually at Harvard at the same time with Nozick, named John Rawls, had an example that he thought showed a problem with his views. Like, what if you just had like really kind of bizarre desires? Like, what if you were like really talented at math, but instead of like working on elaborate like proofs, you just wanted to count the blades of grass in your yard? Like every day you just like, and like that's all you wanted to do. You'd be like, it seems like your life might go better if you did other. I mean, it is your desires. Maybe you could have better sorts of desires. And so that leads people to, okay, desire fulfillment must not be right. And that leads people to the third one. That's the one I mentioned earlier, the subjective list theory. So there are these objective goods. Your life goes well to the extent that you have friends and family, knowledge, autonomy, these sorts of things. But the problem there is, what if you had those things but you didn't enjoy them? What if you just, when you learned things, it did nothing for you? Or what if you thought, okay, I'll go try to have like friends, but you just didn't like people, so you took no pleasure in it?
Yeah.
That doesn't seem like a very good life either.
No, it doesn't.
So maybe you have to feel good, and then you've circled right back to hedonism. And now you're in this vicious circle.
Right.
And it's one of those like vexing like philosophical puzzles, right? About like hedonism seemed right, but there's a problem, which leads to desire fulfillment. But there's a problem, which leads to objective list. But there's a problem, which leads you back. And so a lot of the well-being literature is like trying to, is there some way to kind of combine these theories, different elements of them in different ways? But the rules of the game are like, you have to do it in a way that's like rationally consistent. You have to do it in such a way where you don't have a contradiction. You can't have two propositions that contradict one another. I mean, at its core, like philosophy says, it's not just thinking deeply about these sorts of questions, but thinking about them like bound by rules of like logic and argument.
Jeez. Yeah, I'm just thinking back to that quote. The only thing I know is I know nothing.
And it's funny, you know, I've become much more sympathetic to that quote, like the longer that I've been in philosophy. So I think when you first get into it, right, it's so new, and you can like make these quantum leaps, like, and then, you know, then you get more specialized, then you just sort of, and for me, like, I initially was like really, again, I tried to make myself open to like opposing arguments.
Yeah.
But I was like fairly confident about stuff that I believed about, like, about God, about free will, about these big sorts of questions, skepticism, like, can I know anything? And I've changed my mind about a handful of things, but the difference I would say now is just I'm much more sympathetic to Socrates, like, and I don't know if this is good or bad, but like I've become less confident about almost every philosophical belief than I was like 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. No, I feel the same way.
Yeah. And so I think like that kind of goes back to a theme we were talking about earlier. Like, you know, it became frustrating. Like, it depends. And you're just like, but like, if you're less confident about your beliefs now, like, are you better off in some way? I think that you are. I think that it is, as Socrates really pointed out, he said, look, have I benefited you or have I harmed you by questioning? Right? In the Apology, he talks. The Apology is, for maybe people listening, is written by Plato, but it's purported to be a fairly accurate, like, historical account of Socrates' trial. So when they put him on trial for these crimes against Athens and his defense, right? And he's saying, look, you accuse me of sort of knowingly stirring the pot, like, in a way to, like, harm people, like, questioning people and exposing their ignorance. And he's like, but I don't, he says, I haven't, if I have harmed anyone by doing this, that was never my intention. And isn't it better, right? Is it better to believe something that's false and be really, really certain about it, or to just admit that you don't know? And Socrates says, isn't it better to just know that you don't know than to be really confident and be wrong? And I think, like, there's something really powerful to that.
Yeah, I know, my mind's blown. No, that's really... Yeah, it's kind of funny because it's almost like, to a degree, like, almost goes against, like, the idea of being, like, human, because I feel like the one thing that makes us who we are, I'm sure this can be debated too, but at least my interpretation is, it seems like what makes us who we are is, like, our experiences. But if the things that we believe that make us who we are we don't even know if it's true,
Yeah.
then how do we even know who we are?
Yeah. It's a great question. Um, and I mean, we experience these sorts of things like on a on like a localized sort of level. So I think one of the things that something that helps me like in teach and just in like researching is sort of like when you've got this big sort of question, maybe it can help to like narrow it down to like a specific kind of case. So when you say like your experiences and your beliefs like make you who you are, but how do you know if those beliefs are true, and like does that
Yeah.
so you could think about like, and we've all probably had experiences like this where you really, you know, believed something very strongly and
Yeah.
it turned out that it was false. And
Yeah,
sort
it's
of like,
happened to me a
what does
handful
that
of
what does
times.
that do to your sense of self, right? So,
Yeah.
um, the worst sorts of cases are when like, I mean, in my own experience, but maybe it could be debated, but um, when you really like believe in a particular person, and then it turns out that that person wasn't what you thought they were.
Yeah.
And especially if you've sort of, so I guess I'm thinking of a case where, um, you know, especially somebody that you admire, like maybe morally,
Yeah.
and maybe even think of that person, and they become an inspiration to you, and you then think, well, I'm going to, you find yourself in hard spots, but
Yeah.
you're going to take the high road, and in part because like you look to this person as like your example, and it like becomes like an important kind of brick in that moral belief structure that you have about like the kind of
Yeah.
person you want to be. And then what if you found out that that person was actually very deceptive, or
Yeah.
wasn't what they thought they would be? Like, what would that do to you, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, that I think is those sorts of experiences, right? I think um, I know it wasn't exactly kind of what you were saying, but like, what do you do with that? And the big picture, as you were describing, like, well, if all of my beliefs and all of those things that make me who I am, any one of those things could be false. Well,
Yeah.
then what's left? Um, and I guess it's funny. I haven't really thought about that question in exactly those sorts of terms. But I guess when you think about, I'm an ethicist, right? So I guess when I think about like from the perspective of finding meaning in your life
Yeah.
or the principles that you want to hold, I wonder if you could still evaluate those beliefs, even if it turned out that the basis for some of them turned out to be false. So
Yeah.
even if this person turned out to be an awful human being, and you think, boy, was I wrong about so and so.
Yeah.
But what were those beliefs that they inspired you to have when you thought that they were really great? And if they were things about like integrity and, treating with compassion or these sorts of things, I think you can still like analyze those beliefs and say, are those good things, regardless of
Right.
if what was under. And I think maybe there's still some room to do that. And so maybe even in the uncertainty about like what the world is really like and
Yeah.
whether you can be wrong about things, like maybe those core sorts of principles are something that you can still hang on to.
I feel like it's really funny you brought that up because that's really what I've been kind of like curious about the whole time. Because the one I would probably say for like the past 2 years, I've been pretty confident. The only thing I know is nothing. And the one thing though that, even though that I feel like that is probably the most true thing I've ever came up with, it has still led me to wonder, okay, even if something may not be necessarily like 100% truthful, it's like, how is this gonna make me like a better person?
Yeah.
So, like for me, I'm really into like Stoicism, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm kind of like just curious, like from your perspective, because you know obviously way more about philosophy than I do. But do you feel like there are, obviously there's no such thing as like, I guess like right and wrong can be debated, but from your experience, would you say like there's a more, there's like a better way to like live life? For example, this is kind of like, I feel like it's easier to explain like this. So like in Stoicism, it's like the only thing we can control is how we feel. Some people can argue that, but it's I feel like by you telling yourself that like that's going to give you the most benefit because it gives you like that control and you're not blaming things.
Yeah.
So even if it isn't true, the way I see it is like it's the best way to approach life. So with something like, for example, like something horrible, there's a clip from like Jocko Willink, and basically, whenever something bad happens, he says good, and then he then looks for the good in it. Navy SEAL, a bunch of his buddies died, PTSD, but despite that, he doesn't let that prevent him from, I guess you could say, growing as a person. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is there like a specific set of principles, or I don't know, like some philosopher in general, where they look at life in a perspective that even though we might interpret certain things as bad, there's like a way to look at it in a way that can like empower you.
Yeah, I think most philosophers would probably be open to that idea, and um, I think it might just be good practical advice, like for anybody. So I think like, and maybe this is why when I say it's hard for me to come up with like a specific example. I mean, you mentioned like Stoicism, which I think is sort of like a really powerful way in the history of philosophy, like among views of just like how you can like live life in a way that you kind of, because that's a terrible feeling, right? To just sort of be obsessed with things that you can't control.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
So, but in terms of like trying to find the good and trying to like carry on, like I think maybe the reason that it's not like an area of like great debate is because I think most philosophers would agree that that's what we should do. We try to carry on the best end. Now they will disagree on, in certain cases, what sorts of things count as like wrongs.
Yeah.
But they will, I think, agree that the human, nobody denies that like the human condition, going back to a point we talked about earlier, is going to involve hardship, is going to involve suffering, and so what are your choices when faced with that, right? That like we ought to try to find healthy ways, beneficial ways, positive ways to deal with those sorts of things. And I think I think one of the things that's interesting in philosophy too is just like you get into philosophical discussions and then you kind of find your way like out of philosophy to like other kind of established disciplines. And then I think we start thinking about things like psychology. I think we start thinking about things like mental health. And I think that, there, like that's something that we all like. So we can't avoid it, right?
Yeah.
Our lives are going to be filled with stresses and disappointments and pain.
Absolutely.
But how do we make our way through that in the best way that we can?
Yeah.
And maybe that's the rare thing. Like we can all agree on that, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. So, I'm not sure if there really is an answer, but like you kind of mentioned, it's like, unless you're living in a utopia, obviously, things are going to happen that we're not going to exactly want. So I guess I'm kind of like just wondering, like for you, like have there been like any specific, I guess like guidelines or questions that you've asked yourself when like certain things that you didn't necessarily want to happen like popped up?
Like just personally, like things like
like
obstacles or
so for example, like how do you handle? It's kind of hard to explain. So I guess this is like a difficult. I'm trying to figure out how to word this. I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, unless you're actually, so what I'm saying is every single person at some point in their life is going to experience something that they don't necessarily want,
yeah,
or they don't, enjoy. So when that happens, lots of times people can get in like a negative headspace. So obviously this ties in a lot of things like mental health, but
Hmm.
someone as such as myself, like I'm not saying this to like make it like, oh my god, what was me, but when I was like technically like diagnosed with like depression and anxiety, and that's not because like there's anything wrong with me. I'm
Yeah.
just like brain chemicals are messed up. But even though that happens, I know a lot of people that like controls them,
Mm.
and for me, I feel like I have power over it because I really just changed the way I think about like negative emotions.
Yeah.
Like, because the way I see it is like everything's about balance. And, like, this is something that obviously could be debated, but like the way I see it is it's kind of like the seasons. Like, I really see it like yin and yang. Like, there can be no day without night, and there can be no suffering without happiness. So like my frame of mind has always been when something bad happens, it's like even though this sucks, it's like if I did not suffer, then I would never be able to be happy. Would I never want to be happy? Well, no. Okay, since you
Yeah.
want to be happy, that means you have to accept this suffering. So that's kind of always been my frame of mind.
Yeah.
So I was kind of just like wondering, like, I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but is there like anything like that you like use to get through those times?
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, this is this is one of those very sort of debated um, questions among philosophers. It's sort of like, does there have to be um, like corresponding opposites, right?
Yeah.
So if there's going to be good, does there have to be a bad? If there's going to be beauty, does there have to be ugliness? Does there have to be um, and so, I mean, historically, some philosophers have thought yes, and some philosophers have thought no.
Mm.
There's a view that a lot of Christian philosophers um, adopted, and it's sort of related to something that you and I have discussed previously. One of the big questions in philosophy of religion is the problem of evil, right? So
Right.
if God is all powerful, all knowing, all good, why is there evil in the world? Why wouldn't God stop it? And kind of a related question to that is just, well, why would a good God create evil in the first place? If God created everything
Right.
and there's evil, then God created evil. Why would God create evil? And one response to that
Mm.
by people sympathetic to that kind of theistic picture is evil isn't a thing in itself. It's just the absence of good. So God didn't create evil.
Yeah.
God just didn't create everything wholly good. So it's almost like if I fill up a glass of milk, right? I didn't create the empty space. I just didn't fill
Right.
up the glass all the way.
Okay, that's an
You know?
interesting point.
So when you talk about like the yin and the yang
Yeah.
idea, or like good happiness and unhappiness, like
Yeah.
some people think like kind of the way you were describing, like these are these two kind
Mhm.
of coexisting kind of entities that are sort of going back and forth. And other people think, well, no, the negative entity isn't anything in itself. It's just nothing. It's a privation. So I hate to do it to you again,
Oh
but
yeah, no problem.
it depends, right?
Yeah.
But I will say that uh, it kind of goes back to something that we talked about earlier, right? Like when you do experience, so for me, like when I do experience, you know, difficult things or moments, right?
Mhm.
I think it is kind of helpful to know, right, that like there are just things that are like outside of my control,
Yeah.
and I can't be held morally responsible for things that are outside of my control. And I think that's where that stoic line for me has always. I'm definitely no expert on stoicism,
Yeah.
but but is this something that should be like occupying my headspace? Like whoa, like is it really?
Mhm.
Uh, this is like a silly example. So yesterday, like I think some reason I pulled out onto a road.
Okay.
There was a car behind me. In my mind, it really wasn't like that close.
Yeah.
But this guy was like obviously like mad. Thought I like turned out too soon. And,
Yeah.
Like, drove up on my bumper and like honking. I'm
Oh
like,
man.
come on. And like it was like five. I was like I couldn't. I was like And then I started saying like maybe did I pull it too close? I don't think
Mhm.
I did. It's just like
Yeah.
and it just like and it's sort of like, but wait a minute, like I don't think I did. And even if I did, everything's fine.
Yeah.
Like and this guy's upset, and I'm sorry, and I can't get it. And like I can't be I can't hold myself like
Right.
morally responsible. Now, you have to be careful, right? Because like that, you can use that same line of thinking of just like letting yourself on the hook for all these sorts of things that you might be morally responsible for.
Yeah.
So that's the trick, right? What's really under your control, and there, like formal academic philosophy, I think, again, for me personally, has been sort of helpful. Like I don't have it all figured out, but like there's, as you might imagine, like uh, an enormous amount of work on just the nature of like agency and moral responsibility. So when you say something this kind of stoic line that I think we're really that can be really helpful, I think, to anybody, that like I can only worry about those things that are under my control. What things are those, right? Like,
Yeah.
are you responsible for your mental states? Are you responsible for, I mean, maybe kind of like indirectly. So like Aristotle talks a lot about this. Like if you're the type of person that maybe like this guy that pulled out behind me, like
Yeah.
maybe a little too quick to anger. He
Yeah.
seemed pretty angry. So like if you get really angry at people all the time, and you might think, well, but I can't control that. Like I'm just, well, maybe not in the moment, but like maybe
Right.
you could like
Yeah.
take some steps, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you
For
could
sure.
try to like change. So where are those kinds of lines? And I think that like that that's sort of been helpful for me to kind of like look at my own life, look at my own behaviors, and just sort of like check myself and type of thing. Like, okay, is this the type of thing that like I should really let go because it's a burden that it's unfair for me to put on myself, or is this indicative of something that like maybe is something about my character that I could try to do better on, that I could try,
Mm.
and again, like I'm sure I don't always have it right, but that 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 kind of conscious like I need to check myself here has been of value, and definitely a lot of the philosophy I've read like in those areas I think is helpful for me to like do that kind of soul searching, I guess.
Yeah. No, yeah, that was definitely like very insightful. And I was gonna say like we got to get wrapping things up, but like before we part though,
Yeah.
I guess like do you have any like last words for like the listeners?
I mean, my last words are less about philosophy itself, I guess, than about maybe learning about philosophy. We talked a little bit about that before. So um, I think that, you know, a school like Xavier, where I went, or a school like Niagara, where I'm lucky enough to teach now, that does good work, right? So if any listeners are local, if you're curious and like to know more, if you'd ever like to come to campus, if you want to sit in on my class or one of my colleagues and just kind of get a taste of like what it's like to be in a philosophy class, we're always happy to have visitors. So my last thought would be that, but then the more important last thought was just to say thank you, and I've had the chance to listen to some of your previous episodes, and like it's hard to pin it down exactly, because so I was at my wife and son were asking, so what's this podcast, what's it all about, and I'm like, it's kind of hard to describe, but if I had to, I think you're interested in like positivity in the most general kind of sense, like
Absolutely.
how do we help people, how do we and the episodes I've listened to I think have been fantastic for that, and I think it's really important work.
Thanks.
And I'm really humbled that you asked me to be a small part of it.
Oh no, I appreciate you a ton. Really, really thanks. Like genuinely from the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate you for coming on here, because I know that this episode just has like a lot of insight in it,
Thank you.
a lot of
Thanks.
gold nuggets. I know I'll be taking this stuff with me for the rest of my life. So I appreciate you for coming on here.
My pleasure.
So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, what do you guys think? So yeah, I mean, I just want to say thank you all so much for listening. Stay posted on when it comes to the next episode. Social media as always is gonna be down below. If you have any questions at all, also reach out to him. I'm gonna put his contact information down below. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, well there you go. We got the A-OK. So if you have any questions on there, feel free to reach out to him. So, ladies and gentlemen, until the next one.